Joining me is the executive director of the NFL Players Association, who helped the league and players come to an agreement during the 2011 lockout. With experience both in corporate law and the U.S. Department of Justice, he has worked as the head of the NFLPA since 2009. On behalf of myself and Brandeis University, DeMaurice Smith, thank you for joining the program today.
Man, it is a honor. Thanks for having me, and it was a thrill to see you at Sloan.
Most of our listeners are familiar with the NFL and on-field play. However, can you describe and define what a collective bargaining agreement is?
Yeah, I mean, look, first, you think about in the world of America, hopefully, as many people are represented by a union as possible. And I'm a big believer in trade unionism. A big believer that a group of people working together, can come up with better wages, hours, working conditions for those employees. And that's really where a collective bargaining agreement starts. It starts with the wages, hours, and working conditions of a group of people who belong to a union. And the collective bargaining agreement is simply that document, that legally binding document that governs the wages, hours, working conditions of all of the people in the union, and it's agreed to by the employer. So, the best way to think about a collective bargaining agreement is to think about the absence of one. If there is no collective bargaining agreement, every employee is on his own. Every employee has to negotiate their own wage, their own salary, their own benefits. And in that scenario, I mean, as you can imagine, an employer has a tremendous amount of leverage over you, because if you don't agree to certain terms, they can always fire you and go to find somebody else who will agree to take less. So a collective bargaining agreement really protects workers, and binds management.
Before a new agreement is seemingly signed every single decade, what personnel and groups does the NFLPA speak with to ensure new benefits and standards are introduced?
Yeah, I mean, we make it really easy. Our players negotiate the collective bargaining agreement. So we have 4 union reps per team. Um, and then out of that group of reps, they elect an executive committee of 11. And I work primarily with that group of 11. But I'm a big believer in asking them what issues do you care about? What salary increases do you care about? What benefits should we focus on? I mean, my job is to provide, um, you know, vision and expertise and guiding them to where I think we should be. But that's really a process of soliciting what's important to our players.
How has your relationship with Commissioner Goodell grown during your time at the NFLPA?
Yeah, I mean, the relationships between a labor leader and the head of management is always somewhat contentious. I mean, look, we have gone to war with each other. We have built some very, very good things together. But I represent the workers and he represents the owners. And that means that at times we don't get along, and sometimes it means that we have to fight for our respective constituents. And that means that both of us have to, at times go to war. Look, I mean, those are necessary constructs in a labor and management relationship. So we try to keep the relationship cordial. He was at our party for rookie debut, and in Kansas City, and we had a good dinner, and he came by the party. I mean, we try to keep our relationship and our lines of communication open, but I represent the people who work. He represents the people who own, and we start off with two fundamentally different visions of what we consider to be fair. But our job, at times, is to fight, and sometimes our job is to try to figure it out.
And as you talk about the CBA, the next one won't be signed, or this current one ends in 2030, and likely that will be when a new one is signed. Can there be changes that are made in the middle? And I think of Damar
Yeah.
Hamlin and what happened with him last season. I think of COVID. So can there be amendments and changes, or is it that whatever it is, you got to stick with it for the whole decade?
No, we probably do 15 to 25 side letters almost every term. I mean, we're probably amending the collective bargaining agreement at least 4 or 5 times a year for relatively minor things. Sometimes it's important things. You pointed out COVID was a very, very big negotiation. Literally days after we had signed the collective bargaining agreement. So we look at the document as kind of a living document. The structure and frankly the rigidity of the structure is what gives us the bandwidth to modify the collective bargaining agreement during the terms, right? I mean, think about it the other way. If the collective bargaining agreement was just this really loose, non-structured frame, both sides would have an incentive under those scenarios to simply latch onto the things that they liked, and both sides would go in their corners, and there would really be no way to modify it because you were stuck with a loose system to begin with. We have a very strict system, and so after we negotiate a collective bargaining agreement, which is literally the hardest thing on the planet to do, we know that we have a formed structure around wages, hours, and working conditions. We know that the players are going to get paid. And we also know that, we put a no strike, no lockout clause in our collective bargaining agreement. So that simply means that once that agreement is set, no side can back out of it. So if both sides are locked into it and you come to a moment where you think there might be something that's mutually beneficial for both sides to fix, the collective bargaining agreement actually provides you with a better framework for fixing it, rather than a loose deal. And I would argue, rather than a short-term deal. I'm a big fan of long deals, for a number of reasons. A lot of the other unions, sports unions, do shorter deals, and they have a different economic system than we do. But long deals give us a tremendous amount of runway to grow revenue. And that's one of the reasons why the NFL, remains, for all intents and purposes, America's sport.
While there have been mixed reviews about whether the new NFLPA executive director should have playing experience, how do you think your time at the DOJ helped you grow into this role?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem with saying that the head of the union should be a former player, um, is like saying the head of Apple should know how to do coding, right? Or the head of Marriott needs to know how to build a hotel. I mean, our businesses, especially highly complex businesses, require a tremendous amount of leadership and a tremendous amount of expertise. I mean, I know fans think that this is, a group of people where all day long we just sit around and think about the game. We don't. We're running $2 billion valuation business. We have 800 and I don't know $50 million under asset. We have a $40 million asset, $50 million asset portfolio. We generate $350 million a year. We have 59, nearly 60 partners for which we are doing business. And then my part-time job is being the chairman of One Team Partners, which is a $1.5 billion, nearly $2 billion corporation that is made up of the group licensing rights of Major League Baseball players, ourselves, U.S. Women's National Team, MLS players, and the WNBA. So, that's not a scenario where I think any leadership team should think that the first question is whether it should be a former player or not. So what I benefit from was, as both a trial lawyer, a supervisor, and working for the Department of Justice. I think that gave me really a tremendous frame for effective decision making, being comfortable with making a decision, understanding the gravamen or the stakes that are involved. Building with teams, trying to figure out the best group of people to put together for a team, how to motivate that team, how to make those operations fluid and systemic. But I also think that working for the Department of Justice gave me a sense that there are simply fundamental core values that we all have to embrace, and we don't believe in, sort of, at least over at a union, we don't believe that business necessarily leads us to a moral relativism. In the business world, sometimes I think the risk is, you'll do anything to make money. We have one singular value, and that singular value is to protect the collective body of players. And sometimes that means that there's businesses or business deals that we won't do. We won't do deals that are antithetical to the idea of being a trade union. We don't partner with people who don't believe in trade unionism. And we're always not only looking at what helps our players today, it's really a comprehensive view of what helps them tomorrow. And those are just core values. And I think one of the things that was an advantage of working at the Department of Justice for as long as I did, core values, become ingrained in you, and things that are just sacrosanct, things that you will do, and simply things that you would never do.
Continuing in the realm of politics, in recent months, we've begun to see politics and athletics mixing as former Labor Secretary Marty Walsh resigned from his position to become the executive director of the NHLPA, and former Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker became the new president of the NCAA. Do you expect this trend to grow, and is a political background an asset to labor leadership positions?
Yeah, I think any work asset is a benefit to a labor background. I mean, the reality is that politics has always been a part of sports. The National Football League benefits from congressionally mandated antitrust exemptions. All of these sports hover around things like stadium deals, tax breaks, issues of workers' comp, and the application of local law. All of those things, have always been issues of politics in some way, shape, or form. I think what you are seeing probably today is, thankfully, a little bit more of a recognition that the world of sports, in some respects, operates differently from every other business, and that there is absolutely nothing in the sports world that is not a business. And whether you are a big business or a small business, to some extent, shape, and form, how your business is constructed, how you file your taxes, what tax breaks you get, what grants or offsets you get from a company, how you pay your employees, whether those employees are subject to workers' compensation or whether there's some sort of benefits. All of that is intrinsically wrapped up in politics in some way, shape, or form. I think, the only thing I think that what happens in the sports world that I've always find a little bit frustrating is people think that it doesn't. We run highly complex businesses. It just so happens that instead of marketing or selling, some static or fungible good, we're in the business of sports. But no one should think for a minute that this isn't, at times, a rather brutal bottom line business.
What has been the communication and relationship between the NFLPA and Department of Labor overall?
We've had a tremendous relationship with the Department of Labor since the Obama administration. They thankfully realized that and wrote us a letter, indicating that the National Football League was subject to OSHA laws. We consult with the Department of Labor often on issues relating to workplace safety. I simply believe that the business of sport isn't any different than any other business in the country. And why should they be exempt from complying with all of the laws that frankly protect every other worker in America?
On two separate recent occasions, players have been suspended for violating the NFL's gambling policy. What does the CBA exactly state, and will the league consider, or will the NFLPA consider adding education resources to prevent this from happening again?
Yeah, we've always had educational resources with respect to every rule that exists in in our gambling ecosystem, in our NFL ecosystem. I mean, players who violate the law really don't have an excuse of not knowing. So, resources for education really isn't the issue. Complying with the rules is the issue. With respect to the gambling policy is something that is unilaterally imposed by the National Football League. It's not collectively bargained. So there are some rules that are collectively bargained. There are some things that are not. Every employer in America, um, when they're negotiating a collective bargaining agreement, the law calls it the management's rights clause. Management's rights clause simply says in general that any employer is allowed to come up with reasonable rules with respect to its benefit, its business, that are purely within the purview of management. So, if management decides, and you're working at a barbecue stand, and management decides that they're going to take steak off the menu and put pork, the employees really don't have a right to say, we're going to argue about what the employer can sell. If the employer wants to be closed on Sunday, that's well within the management's rights clause. So developing rules with respect to operating a business are generally rules that the employer can unilaterally impose. What the collective bargaining agreement does is, once those rules are set, a good collective bargaining agreement, for the most part, tries to address the process by which punishment is meted out, or due process rights of the employee are protected. So that's where our collective bargaining agreement, fits with the unilateral rules that the league, tries to impose. So, when it comes to gambling, whether it's gambling or drug use or steroid use, or rules, with respect to cheating, or rules with respect to on field, I mean, all of those things are rules that the employer has a reasonable right to impose.
Last week, Baltimore Ravens quarterback Lamar Jackson signed a new contract extension with $185 million in guaranteed money. What counseling does the NFLPA provide for self-represented players, including Jackson, who are in the process, or were in the process of negotiating?
Yeah, extensive. We have a full salary cap and resource department. We have a number of lawyers on site to help players. We were actively involved in Mr. Jackson's contract negotiations. I think that he did a phenomenal job negotiating his contract. In many respects, his contract was structurally better than some of the contracts we've seen recently. And yeah, I mean, I think he did a fantastic job.
Are you a proponent or supporter of self-represented players versus those who are represented by agents, or are you more so just looking again for the overall interest of the players?
I'm a big proponent of good contracts.
Okay.
So, in some cases, we've seen We've seen contracts negotiated by certified contract advisors that were not as good as Lamar Jackson's contract. So I don't, I don't really, I'm not in a position to decide whether somebody is self-represented, or not. I care that our players get fair contracts, and I care that they use their leverage to leverage themselves into good contracts, and I care that they have someone who does a good job with the structure and the language of the contract. In many respects, the language of the contract is as important, if not more important, than the money that allegedly is being paid to the player. A lot of players or a lot of agents talk about how much money they got for their client, but if that money isn't guaranteed, that doesn't mean that the player's ever going to get it. It's illusory. If the
Or
contract
unreachable incentives.
Sorry?
Or unreachable incentives.
Or unreachable incentives. We don't really see as many of those as we used to. I mean, those kind of went away when we did the 2011, CBA. Those were, mostly not likely to be earned incentives, which, I mean, I wouldn't even consider those incentives. Those were just jokes. If a punter leads the team in tackles, that's not really an incentive. That's just a sham clause of the contract that was actually put into the contract to theoretically eat up cap space so that the team wouldn't have to pay the money. So, when you talk about those not likely to be earned incentives back before 2011, I know the punter, leading the team in tackles is a crazy hypothetical, but in the old days, if that was a $50 million bonus, I'm sorry, yeah, or $50 million, potential bonus, that actually counted as $50 million against the salary cap, which is stupid, because that just simply means that's $50 million not being paid, not to the punter. That's $50 million not being paid to other players. So, the real problem with a lot of our contracts that come out and say that X player is going to be paid $250 million, whatever amount of that $250 million that is not guaranteed, you should assume, because it's likely, that balance is never going to get paid to the player. Worse yet, if someone says that it includes X amount of guaranteed money, but that guarantee is only triggered if the player is on an opening day roster, that means that you've given the team the option of not putting him on the opening day roster, but it also means that he doesn't get paid. So it's not really guaranteed money. So I'm not really spending a lot of time between whether a player should be represented or not. I care whether or not the contract that the player has agreed to is a good one or not.
Well, talking about money, obviously the money comes from the ownership. How does new ownership now in Denver
Actually,
and Washington?
the money doesn't.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if you are working at a barbecue stand and you're selling sandwiches,
Okay, yeah. So the money then comes from the fans, yeah, and from commercials and all that.
well, and it comes from what else if you're working at the barbecue stand? Your work, right? I mean, the owner might own the business and the owner might, buy the meat, but the owner is hiring you to go out and sell sandwiches or make sandwiches. And at the end of the day, your work, his product, results in revenue. So this idea that the National Football League is blessed to have 32 men and the money comes from them, well, let's just reverse it. Let's put those 32 guys on the field and let's see how much money they make, right? I mean, I'd pay a little bit of money to watch one of those guys run up and down the field. I would. I mean, it probably wouldn't be $19 billion, but I'd pay a little bit of money to see if they can make it from one end of the end zone to the other without collapsing. So, at the end of the day, I mean, this is we're going to generate nearly $20 billion this year, but we only generate $20 billion because of what the players do on the field. And at the end of the day, that joint product results in what we call revenue, and then that revenue is split nearly evenly between the owners and the players.
Well, for ownership in Denver and Washington, and I guess this is new ownership, how does these new owners now affect overall labor negotiations? Because now you have a
Not
new
not not at all.
new seat at the table doesn't mean anything.
No, because they don't even have a seat at the table. I mean,
Okay.
we bargain with the management council, and the management council is not made up of any of those new owners.
Okay. As talks are ongoing for finding a new NFLPA executive director, what traits do you hope the new director holds, and what changes do you hope are adopted in the new CBA in 2030?
Well, I'm not really going to predict anything for the new CBA. I mean, we fight over wages, hours, and working conditions, and another thing that people just don't sometimes forget. When you're engaged in a collective bargaining agreement, you have two goals. Yes, you have the goal of increasing your shares of revenue, increasing the money that's coming to players, or improving the benefits, or improving anything else that you might be interested in. But at the same time, you have an equal focus on not losing any of those benefits. I mean, if you look at workers in America right now, what's happening? Workers, for the most part, are working longer with fewer benefits rather than working shorter with more benefits. I mean, that's just reality. So, and a lot of people who are listening to your podcast, who are graduating will, go out and you'll look for jobs. My guess is less than 20% of you will go to a company that has a retirement pension, right?
Mhm.
Almost none of you will have a 401k. All of you will hopefully have, some sort of healthcare system at your company, but the range and the quality of those healthcare packages are going to vary wildly between those people. So the reason all of those things are happening is because the majority of the people in the United States right now are going to work for companies that don't have unions. And if you're a manager, or if you're management, or if you're the owner of a business, let's go back to, any restaurant you're going to work for, any company you're going to work for. Does management have an incentive to pay for all of your healthcare? No. If he can find someone who is willing to work there and not take healthcare, is he going to hire someone who doesn't want the healthcare, or is he going to hire someone who wants the healthcare? If there's a group of people who don't want the healthcare or willing to work without the healthcare, so be it. So, you look at companies like Walmart and some of those companies that don't give their employers a 40-hour work week. The only reason they're not giving them their 40-hour work week is the law requires that a 40-hour work week come with benefits. So what does Walmart do? Walmart hires two of you, and you both work 20 hours a week. You want to work 40 hours a week because you could get benefits. They don't want you to work 40 hours a week, because if they have two people working 25 hours a week, they're getting 50 hours a week of work without paying any one of you healthcare benefits. So, everybody needs to get their head around that. While I'm to a certain extent, an unabashed capitalist, capitalism in its purest form isn't isn't designed to be fair. It's designed to build the most capital. And if that capital comes at the expense of one person, for the benefit of another person, we might say, that's great, that's free enterprise, and yes, let's slap it with another label. But if you're trying to provide for your family, how do you feel about working 50 hours a week for two different companies, and those companies benefiting wildly from your work, but they're cheating you out of benefits? So, you think about what the traits of the next executive director, that I hope the players understand, is this is a very difficult job in a very difficult business environment, where there are tremendous amounts of leverage against the players. We only play for our players play for 3.5 years and have a 100% injury rate. Worse yet, there is a never ending supply of highly qualified workers to come into this business who at any minute can replace anyone. And here's the other final problem. No matter who's on the field, you know what? You're going to watch. You're going to watch. And that simply means that, unlike if this were Coca-Cola, or unlike if this was your favorite fast food restaurant, if you go to the store the next day and your favorite soft drink, you pop the can and sip the can and you taste it and spit it out, and you decide, this doesn't taste good anymore. What do? You buy the other product. If your sandwich at your restaurant doesn't taste good anymore, you stop going to the restaurant. So we have a level of competition in the market where consumers' choice acts as a governor on how good or how well someone produces that product. We have a system, and most major sports have a system in this country, where the owners know that for the most part you are going to watch no matter what. So that leaves all of the leverage with the people who are actually doing the work, trying to find their own leverage. And when you're picking the next person, my hope is that the players understand just how fragile this ecosystem is, and what it takes primarily to get things done in this job, knowing that the consumers are never going to leave. And to a certain extent, because of all the things we've mentioned, the employees are never going to go on strike. Right?
Always. Fantastic observations, great insight. DeMaurice Smith, thank you again for joining WBRS today.
Man, my pleasure. And thank you. Thanks for coming up to me at Sloan, and congratulations on your graduation.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Take care.